Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Thomas, and I am excited to partner with Agape Partners International and share with you about some important topics that are not very often addressed in our community. We will be talking today about divorce and remarriage from a counseling perspective. I'm so thankful to the leadership team for allowing me this opportunity, and I hope that the conversation begins here and continues to happen in the days ahead. So, when we talk about divorce and remarriage, I want to first start off with this image of the kintsugi. It is a Japanese art, and it's this idea that when a vessel or some piece of clay is broken, and when you put the pieces back together with gold as the sort of glue to stick the pieces back together, you get at the very end a stronger structure. It takes care of maybe some of the fault lines and areas that were weak when it breaks and you bring it back together with gold. And so it's this idea that, you've heard the biblical concept of being a broken vessel, right? Willing to be used by the master. And so in order for us to embrace this imperfection and embrace the flaws and the brokenness that is within each and every one of us, because we are all born into sin and have fallen, and so we embrace this imperfection, but what the result is this strength and beauty that comes from the molding together of these broken pieces, and then there is a restoration that happens, a newness in this new vessel that God allows us to experience. And it's this beautiful thing that God does in our lives and our bodies, not just through the salvation story, but through all of the different life experiences that we go through. And ultimately, if we allow this brokenness to be mended and healed and restored, then we can see that God can be glorified in our experiences, even our negative experiences. So I wanted to start off with that imagery because I think it sets us up on the correct path of purpose. For which we are being restored and made like Him. And the ultimate purpose is the glorification of our Savior. So, as we talk about counseling perspectives of divorce and remarriage, I want to specifically talk about the impact as being threefold. One being the psychological impact, then second being familial, and three being communal, in no particular order, but all three have an impact. So let's first start with divorce. We'll talk about the impacts of each of those in this situation where there is a divorce, whether that's yours or if someone that you know or love have been through divorce. From a psychological perspective, we start off with this idea of guilt versus shame. Now, guilt is I have done something wrong, and shame says something is wrong with me. I am wrong. I am bad, right? As opposed to I did something bad. So there is an internalization that happens in shame that sometimes is one of the psychological effects of having gone through a divorce. There's also this identity shift. Sometimes the roles that we carry and the hats that we wear are such a huge part of our identity that without it, let's say I am wife, mom, professor, counselor, and without the wife identity, who am I, right? So there's this identity shift that happens. There's also a spiritual struggle in that we might have questions for God. Why did you allow this to happen? I was a faithful minister, missionary. I was doing all the things that you wanted me to do, and yet this is what happens to me. And so this question of why, God, why would you allow this to happen? Sometimes it's even scary to say those things out loud, but we have some questions, and it's very human to have questions and wonder why. That all of these things can lend to some negative beliefs like I am unlovable, I'm not worthy, I'm not in control. Whatever those negative beliefs might be, it takes a psychological toll. Finally, there's this idea of broken trust, right? That broken trust spans a lot of different arenas, right? It can be broken trust in myself. I thought I knew what I was getting myself into when I chose this marriage. It could be broken trust in other people, right? Not just a spouse, but maybe family members, other people that got involved. But specifically, right, maybe perhaps the opposite gender. And then also broken trust in God, right? How, again, right, that spiritual struggle of why, God, did you let this happen? How can I trust that you want things for my good? So, from a familial perspective, there are many effects to divorce. Sometimes there are emotional effects that children can be drawn into choosing a side or drawn into the conflict. And there might even be a scapegoat, someone you blame for all of the struggles. And so the emotional effects of that are many. Then we've got some relational effects. Obviously, there is a shift in the family system, and therefore there's going to be naturally strained relationships. So families get affected, right? Extended families, grandparents and in-laws, and all of these things are relational shifts within the family. There might be some behavioral changes and effects. There might be some anger that shows up, some resentment or bitterness. But sometimes what we're going through internally pops up in behavioral fashion, and that begins to impact the family system. And finally, the long-term impact of on children, particularly when there are other people involved, when there are children involved, that you have now this responsibility to co-parent well. Now you are parenting under two different roofs, and therefore there's a long-term impact for the good or bad. It depends, right? But we've got to engage in these conversations so that these impacts don't cause damage in our systems. The communal impact. There's a social stigma related to divorce, to cases of divorce and remarriage. And so sometimes when the community doesn't really know how to respond to your crisis, then you might be left feeling isolated, excluded, out of the circle, right? And sometimes it may not be intentional, but it might just be that people don't know how to have that conversation or broach those topics. And so then you might feel like you are alone in that. Extended families, relationships with in-laws and other people, that cousins, friends, right? All these people that those extended relationships that have now maybe come to a close or maybe are strained because of the divorce. Finally, church community strain. Sometimes different churches even have different views on divorce. And so that can be really hard to navigate if you are feeling more judgment rather than support within the church community. Now, we also know that in our community, that is a very collectivistic community, but we gather a lot, we glean a lot from that societal support, but also the community can bring a lot of harm when rumors are spread and it keeps going and becoming, evolving as a bigger story or a different kind of story, or more negative impression than maybe where it started, almost like that game of telephone. But there are these negative impacts to the community and from this communal level, right, with divorce. Now, if we talk about remarriage and these three impacts on remarriage, let's start with psychological. There might be some unresolved struggles, right? I give this analogy of rocks and backpack because sometimes we don't realize the weight we are carrying around as we enter into new circumstances or relationships. Those unresolved feelings or background or trauma or history might then go with you into new relationships in ways that you probably didn't intend. And so it's really important, and it behooves us to make sure we address some of these things before we enter into new circumstances. But with that, there's this hope, right? This newfound hope of companionship and love. And so then that might come with some set of expectations of what this marriage should be like versus what it was for you prior. So this hope and companionship, there's a lot of positive there, but we also have to be careful with our expectations. I say to most newly married couples, I say this, I say, be careful not to expect from your spouse what only God can give you, right? There is a God-shaped hole in our hearts and in our lives that only God can fill. And sometimes we look to a spouse to fill those needs and meet those expectations, and we find ourselves disappointed. The reality is that a lot of us lean towards avoidance and ignorance. In a community that maybe doesn't know how to really well deal with and manage emotions, we tend to then suppress and dismiss them and pretend they don't exist because that feels safer. That feels more comfortable than having to actually deal with the emotions. And so it's very common to avoid and ignore that there's even a problem. From a familial perspective, blended families might present some challenges. Step parenting starts to happen. Co-parenting has to happen under two different roofs. And so now the two family systems are coming together. There are a brand new set of challenges. And it's important for us as families to make sure we are having the good conversations and setting some rules and expectations from the get-go so that we don't get trapped in a battle of wills or a pride or ego struggle or anything that might cause further damage to children or extended family. So making sure we have those conversations. Children, if there are children from both marriages, previous marriages, then there might be some sense of competition or jealousy or difficulty bonding with one parent or the other. And so children are impacted in the family unit, right? And so really taking time to set up new rules and expectations will be really important. There might be some level of discord, taking sides, and maybe even culture clashes, right? So really taking time to have these good, healthy, honest conversations will be really important. From a communal perspective, shifting social dynamics, right? Now you are entering into new circles and new spheres. And so you want to make sure that as a community that we are accommodating and adjusting with the systemic changes in the family because it requires a reintegration, right? After something's been broken and put together, now we need to re-enter as this new vessel, right? And so re-entering social circles and building and creating new relationships is going to be a big challenge, but an inevitable challenge, but at the same time can be a very fruitful part of your support system and building that life back up. And the church community has this opportunity to be the support system, to be a person that we can stand beside, that we can stand beside people when they're hurting and walk beside them on their journey. And the church has this opportunity to be that in the way that God designed for people that are hurting. So when we shift from that to practical considerations, what does it look like to handle divorce and remarriage well? When we go back to this idea of kintsugi, the Japanese art, that it needs to be repaired and molded and brought back together. And so from a psychological perspective, we need to heal. There is an emotional, spiritual, and physical healing that needs to happen in order for us to move forward. Let's not neglect that because it's less important or not visible on the surface, but let's really take care of our psyche, our inner being, so that we can move forward and be the vessels that God has created us to be. From a familial lens, we need to rebuild, right? When there is brokenness in the family system, that rebuilding takes some time and energy and effort, and that's okay. It is normal for that to take some time, but we need to be intentional about building that back up so that it is on firm ground, right? It has good roots, and the expectations are set properly, and they can move forward in a healthy fashion. And finally, from a communal level, we need support. We need trusted, non-judgmental, spiritual warriors and counselors who are going to stand beside us in this time of rebuilding and healing, right? We as a church have the opportunity to be that community and be that support for people. And so that's going to take some intentionality to not be judgmental and not be quick to speak, but really just be a presence for people, a loving presence, people that will stand beside those that are hurting. So ultimately, for the purpose of restoration and ultimately glorification of Jesus Christ in and through our testimonies and our brokenness, I'm going to close with 5 C's. One being Christ. Ultimate healing comes from Him. He is our source of strength and sustenance, even when things are hard, even when there is brokenness. But He can transform even the most grave sins, the most grave situations into something that can bring Him glory. Notice what it says in Matthew 11. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." If we go to Him and the Father in prayer, in supplication, in surrender, then He can do a work in us that only He can do. Courage. This takes some level of bravery to have honest communication, take some steps to meet the needs that you have experienced yourself having. Notice that if you don't know what your body needs, we won't be able to meet the need, right? So really honest communication to know what you need, but also to enter into spaces where it's not easy, it's not comfortable, but that you would push through in courage. Connection. Now connection is multi-layered because one, it has to be mind and body connection. I know what I need and my body is trying to tell me so that I can respond appropriately, but also interpersonal between people, right? That I would maintain a connection so that we can encourage one another, as First Thessalonians says, and build each other up. Spiritual connection, maintaining our connection with the Father so that that does not run dry and that we have life through that relationship with Him that gives us the energy and the gas power to move forward. Compassion, empathy, non-judgmental, and often individualized attention, right? Compassion says that you will be heard. I will sit with you and I will understand from a non-judgmental lens and love you no matter what. As Ephesians 4 says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. Let's be loving and be the church that God has called us to be. Finally, commitment. This rebuilding and healing and repairing involves some growth. In order to overcome some wounding, it takes some work and time and energy. And I pray that you would allow that time to do the work that time can do, that God to do the work that He can do, and really commit to the process. Not give up on yourself or the situation, but push through even when it feels hard. Because notice what Philippians 2 says, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose. Sometimes I think in our brokenness and in our limited understanding, we think that we are useless after there's some level of brokenness in our vessel. And the reality is, if we can surrender to His restoration within us, we can then have Him glorified even in our brokenness. Let's not underestimate what God can do even in our weakness, even in our brokenness. That is His greatest stage to really do something big and make Himself known and to be glorified in the masses. You saw that in the miracles that happened in Scripture, where some of the greatest healings happened in spaces where then God could be glorified, then people could come to the knowledge of God. Why? Because these miracles happened. And sometimes it takes that commitment to growth and commitment to overcoming wounding so that God can fulfill that purpose within us. As we move forward as the vessels we are, whatever your brokenness might look like, may you be encouraged, whether that's divorce or remarriage or others going through similar things, but whatever that might be, that I pray that you would allow God to rebuild and heal those places within you so that you might be restored, but also so that God may be glorified. May God bless you.